Elena didn't know that the man watching her from across the ballroom was the most powerful alpha in the realm. She didn't know that the golden thread she felt pulling at something deep in her chest was the mating bond awakening. And she certainly didn't know that the expensive engagement ring weighing down her finger was about to become completely meaningless. All she knew was that she couldn't breathe. The ballroom pressed in around her like a gilded cage. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors, and the air was thick with perfume and politics. Lords and ladies swirled past in their finest silks, their laughter sharp as broken glass. Eleanor stood frozen near the towering windows, her emerald gown a gift from her fiancé that felt more like a costume than clothing. Lord Marcus had chosen everything: the dress, the jewels, even the way she wore her hair. Her fingers twisted the engagement ring he'd placed there 3 weeks ago, the enormous diamond catching the light with every nervous movement. It was beautiful, expensive, cold as ice against her skin. "Smile, darling," Marcus had whispered in her ear an hour ago. "You're about to be the envy of every woman here." His hand had lingered too long on her waist, possessive and claiming in a way that made her stomach turn. She wasn't the envy of anyone. She was a transaction, her family's mounting debts exchanged for her hand in marriage, their desperation packaged in silk and presented to society as a love match. Elena pressed closer to the window, watching her reflection in the dark glass. The woman staring back looked like a stranger. Perfect posture, perfect dress, perfect submission. She lifted her hand to the glass, and her ring clinked against the surface. That's when she felt it. Heat, sudden and consuming, spreading from her chest outward like liquid fire. Elena gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Something was pulling at her, deep in her chest where her heart hammered against her ribs. A golden thread, thin as spun light, tugging her toward. "You look like you're about to run." The voice was low, rough like whiskey and smoke. Elena spun around, her skirts rustling against the marble, and found herself staring up into the most intense amber eyes she'd ever seen. The man was tall, impossibly tall, with dark hair and shoulders that strained against his perfectly tailored jacket. He stood close enough that she could smell cedar and rain on his skin, close enough that the heat in her chest flared brighter. Elena's breath caught in her throat. The golden thread pulled tighter, and she had to grip the window frame to keep from stepping toward him. "Excuse me." His mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Running. You have the look of someone plotting an escape." He glanced at the ballroom behind them, then back to her face. "Can't say I blame you. These things are suffocating." Elena's fingers tightened on her skirts. She should excuse herself, return to Marcus, play the perfect fiancé. Instead, she found herself studying the stranger's face, memorizing the sharp line of his jaw and the way his eyes seemed to see straight through her careful facade. "I'm not running anywhere," she said, though her voice sounded breathless even to her own ears. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." "Are you?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Elena felt the ring on her finger grow heavier, and she lifted her hand without thinking, the diamond catching the chandelier light. "I'm engaged," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "To Lord Marcus Blackwood. This is our engagement party." She held up her hand, letting the ring speak for itself. "I'm off limits." For a moment the stranger said nothing. His amber eyes dropped to her hand, studying the ring with an expression she couldn't read. Then, before Elena could react, before she could even breathe, he reached out and took her hand in his. His touch was electric. Fire raced up Elena's arm and spread through her entire body, the golden thread in her chest singing with recognition. She should pull away, should slap him, should call for Marcus. Instead, she stood frozen as the stranger's thumb brushed over the engagement ring. "It means nothing now," he said softly, and then he slipped the ring off her finger. Elena stared at her bare hand, her mouth falling open in shock. The ring sat in the stranger's palm, the diamond winking mockingly in the ballroom light. Without it, her hand felt impossibly light, free. "You can't," she started, but the words died in her throat, because for the first time in 3 weeks she could breathe again. The stranger closed his fingers around the ring, making it disappear into his jacket pocket. "I just did." His eyes met hers, and Elena felt the world tilt sideways. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Before Elena could answer, before she could even think, Marcus's voice cut through the ballroom noise like a blade. "Elena, there you are, darling." His footsteps clicked against the marble as he approached, and Eleanor felt the suffocating weight settle back over her chest. "I've been looking everywhere for you." The stranger's expression didn't change, but Eleanor felt something dangerous shift in the air around him. He stepped slightly closer to her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Marcus," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her left hand was still bare, still free, and she curled her fingers into her palm to hide the evidence. "Lord Blackwood," the stranger said, and there was something in his tone that made Marcus stop short, something that made Eleanor's pulse race for entirely different reasons. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he looked between them. "And you are?" The stranger smiled, but it was sharp as winter wind. "Someone who believes your fiancé deserves better than a ring that doesn't fit." Eleanor's breath caught. Marcus's face flushed red, his hand moving to Eleanor's elbow with bruising force. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," Marcus began, but the stranger cut him off with a look that could have frozen fire. "No misunderstanding," he said quietly, "just a correction." And Eleanor realized, as she stood between the two men, with her bare hand hidden in her skirts and her heart racing like thunder, that everything was about to change. The days that followed were a whirlwind of whispered rumours and stolen glances. Elena had managed to slip away from the ballroom that night before Marcus could demand answers about her missing ring. She'd claimed a headache, retreating to her family's modest estate on the outskirts of the capital. But sleep had been impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt those amber eyes watching her, felt the electric touch of the stranger's fingers as he'd claimed what wasn't his to take, what she'd wanted him to take. The realization left her pacing her bedroom floor until dawn, her bare ring finger catching on her nightgown with every gesture. She told her mother the ring was being resized, a small lie that bought her time to think, to breathe, to figure out what madness had possessed her in that ballroom. On the third morning he came to her. Eleanor was in the garden behind their house, tending to her mother's roses, when she felt that familiar pull in her chest. The golden thread tightened, and she looked up to find him standing at the garden gate like something out of a dream. In daylight he was even more imposing, tall and broad-shouldered, with those impossible amber eyes that seemed to see straight through her soul. He wore simple clothes today, dark trousers and a white shirt open at the collar, but there was something about the way he carried himself that spoke of absolute power. "You," Elena breathed, her pruning shears falling forgotten to the grass. "Me?" he agreed, his mouth quirking into that almost smile that made her stomach flutter. "May I come in?" Elena glanced back at the house, where her mother was no doubt watching from the kitchen window. "I don't even know your name." "Kieran," he said, and the name rolled off his tongue like honey. "And you're Eleanor Whitmore, 22 years old, daughter of a merchant family that's been struggling since your father's ships were lost in the winter storms." Eleanor's breath caught. "How do you—" "I make it my business to know things." He stepped closer to the gate, his fingers curling around the iron bars. "Especially when those things concern my mate." The word hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her chest where the golden thread thrummed with recognition. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Mate bonds are just— they're stories, fairy tales to make arranged marriages seem romantic." Kieran's expression softened, and for the first time since she'd met him, Eleanor saw something vulnerable in those amber depths. 3 years ago, I would have agreed with you," he said quietly. I was married then, a political alliance like yours to Blackwood. My wife was a good woman, kind and gentle. I cared for her deeply." His voice roughened. "She died in childbirth, the child too." Elena's heart clenched. "Kieran, I'm so—" "I thought that was it for me," he continued, his eyes never leaving her face. "I thought I'd had my chance at partnership, at family. I accepted that I'd rule alone." He paused, his knuckles white on the gate. "And then I saw you across that ballroom, and everything I thought I knew about bonds and fate and love changed in an instant." Eleanor stared at him, her mind racing. The golden thread in her chest pulled tighter, urging her toward him, but fear held her back. "I can't," she said, her voice breaking. "My family, we owe Lord Blackwood a fortune, my father's debts, the interest compounding every month. If I break the engagement, we'll lose everything, the house, the business, everything." Tears burned her eyes. "I can't be the reason my family ends up on the streets." "What if you didn't have to choose?" The question hung between them like a lifeline. Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, studying his face. "What do you mean?" Kieran reached into his jacket and pulled out her engagement ring. The diamond caught the morning sun, but instead of the cold fire she remembered, it looked small now, insignificant. "This ring represents a debt," he said, holding it up between them. 20,000 gold pieces, according to Blackwood's records. What if that debt simply disappeared? Elena's mouth fell open. "You can't be serious. That's a fortune. More money than my family has ever seen." "Not to me." The simple words carried such casual confidence that Eleanor felt the world tilt sideways. She gripped the garden gate for support, her mind struggling to process what he was offering. "Who are you?" she whispered. Kieran's smile was soft and devastating. "Someone who can afford to buy your freedom. Someone who wants to give you a choice." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see flecks of gold in his amber eyes. "Give me 1 week, Elena, 7 days to show you what we could have together. If at the end of that week you still want to marry Blackwood, I'll pay your family's debts and walk away. And if I don't—" His eyes darkened with promise. "Then I'll spend the rest of my life showing you what it means to be treasured instead of traded." Elena's breath came in short gasps. The rational part of her mind screamed that this was madness. You didn't just walk away from arranged marriages. You didn't trust mysterious strangers who appeared in your garden, making impossible promises. You certainly didn't feel this devastating pull toward a man whose last name you didn't even know. But the golden thread in her chest sang with rightness, and for the first time in 3 weeks Elena felt something that might have been hope. 1 week, she heard herself say, and Kieran's smile was like sunrise. 1 week, he agreed. Then, because he was apparently determined to shatter every expectation she had, he opened the gate and stepped into her garden like he belonged there. Elena's mother chose that moment to appear on the back steps, her eyes wide as she took in the stranger standing among her roses. "Elena!" her mother called, uncertainty colouring her voice. Elena looked between Kieran and her mother, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the moment, the choice that would change everything. "Mother," she called back, her voice surprisingly steady, "I'd like you to meet someone." As Kieran moved to stand beside her, Eleanor felt the golden thread in her chest settle into something that felt almost like peace. She still didn't know his last name, still didn't understand how he could so casually offer to solve all her family's problems, but she had 1 week to find out, 1 week to discover if fairy tales could come true. Elena's choice came on the 4th day, wrapped in morning mist and the scent of her mother's tea roses. She had spent 3 days watching Kieran move through her world like he belonged there. He helped her father examine the damaged ledgers, his long fingers tracing columns of debt with a businessman's precision. He listened to her mother's stories about the estate's history, his amber eyes warm with genuine interest. He walked the gardens with Elena in the evenings, their conversations ranging from books to philosophy to the way starlight caught in her hair. He never pressed, never demanded, never made her feel like time was running out, even though they both knew it was. But this morning was different. This morning Eleanor woke with certainty settling in her chest like a stone. She found him in the library, reading by the window where early sunlight turned his dark hair to burnished gold. He looked up when she entered, and that familiar heat flared between them. "I've decided," she said without preamble. Kieran set down his book, his full attention focusing on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "And?" "1 week," Elena said, stepping closer. "I want to know what this is between us. I want to understand why I feel like I've been sleepwalking my entire life until now." She reached for his hands, marvelling at how perfectly they fit together. "I want to choose for myself just once." The smile that spread across Kieran's face was devastating. He stood, still holding her hands, and Eleanor felt the golden thread in her chest sing with rightness. "Eleanor," he murmured, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. Before either of them could say more, the library door slammed open with enough force to rattle the windows. Lord Marcus Blackwood stood in the doorway, his face twisted with rage and his pale eyes blazing. "So this is where my wayward fiancé has been hiding," Marcus snarled, his gaze taking in their joined hands with obvious disgust. "Playing house with some nameless fortune hunter." Elena felt Kieran go perfectly still beside her, but his hands remained gentle on hers. When he spoke, his voice was quiet as winter wind. "Lord Blackwood, you're trespassing." Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "Trespassing? I'm collecting what belongs to me." His eyes fixed on Elena with possessive hunger. "Did you really think you could just disappear, darling? That I wouldn't notice my investment had gone missing?" Investment! The word hit Elena like a slap, and she felt her spine straighten with sudden fury. "I am not your investment," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "Or your property. The engagement is over, Marcus." "Like hell it is." Marcus stepped into the library, his hand moving to the sword at his side. "Do you have any idea what your little rebellion has cost me? The contracts I've broken, the alliances I've damaged?" His voice rose with each word. "You signed a binding agreement, Elena. You and your pathetic family owe me, and I will collect." "Actually," Kieran said, his tone conversational despite the danger crackling in the air, "they don't." Marcus's eyes snapped to him, confusion replacing some of the rage. "What?" Kieran released Elena's hands and reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded document. "The Whitmore family debt has been paid in full. All contracts with House Blackwood are null and void." He held out the paper with casual indifference. "Would you like to see the receipts?" Eleanor's mouth fell open. "Kieran, what did you—" 23,000 gold pieces, Kieran continued, his amber eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "Principal, interest and penalties paid to your creditors this morning." His smile was sharp as a blade. "Elena Whitmore is free to marry whomever she chooses." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at the document like it might burst into flames, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and something that might have been fear. 23,000, he repeated faintly. "That's... who are you?" "Someone who values what you threw away," Kieran replied. Marcus's hand tightened on his sword hilt. "I don't care if you're the richest merchant in the kingdom. Elena is mine by right of contract, and I won't be cheated by some upstart with more gold than sense." The change in Kieran was immediate and terrifying. One moment he was the gentleman who had read quietly in her library. The next, power radiated from him like heat from a forge, and Eleanor felt every survival instinct she possessed scream in recognition of an apex predator. "Careful, Blackwood," Kieran said softly, and his voice carried authority that made the air itself seem to bow. "You're about to make a mistake you can't unmake." Marcus actually took a step back, his bravado cracking. "You can't threaten me. I have allies, connections." "You had contracts," Kieran corrected. "Contracts that no longer exist. As for allies—" He tilted his head, considering. "How many of those allies do you think will stand with you when they learn you've been harassing the chosen mate of the Alpha King?" The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Elena felt the breath leave her lungs in a rush, her mind struggling to process what she'd just heard. Alpha King. Kieran was the Alpha King. The most powerful man in the realm had been sitting in her garden for 3 days, helping her mother tend roses. Marcus's sword clattered to the floor, his face going ash pale. "Your Majesty, I didn't know." "Now you do." Kieran's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Lady Eleanor Whitmore is under royal protection. Any further harassment of her or her family will be considered an act of treason." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I trust I make myself clear." "Perfectly clear, Your Majesty," Marcus stammered, dropping into a hasty bow. "My sincerest apologies for the misunderstanding." "Get out." Marcus practically ran from the library, the door slamming behind him with enough force to rattle Elena's teeth. In the sudden silence, she could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. "Alpha King," she whispered. Kieran turned to her, and for the first time since she'd known him, uncertainty flickered in his amber eyes. "Elena, you're the Alpha King." She sank into the nearest chair, her legs no longer willing to support her. "The ruler of the entire realm just paid my family's debts and threatened a lord for me." "Yes." The simple honesty of it broke something open in her chest. Eleanor looked up at him, this impossibly powerful man who had chopped wood for her father and listened to her mother's stories and made her feel like she was worth something more than a marriage contract. "Why?" she asked. Kieran knelt in front of her chair, his hands reaching for hers with infinite gentleness. "Because you're everything, Elena. Because the moment I saw you, I knew I'd been waiting my entire life for you to look at me the way you're looking at me now." Elena stared into his amber eyes, feeling the golden thread in her chest pull taut with truth and possibility, and a love so fierce it took her breath away. "I'm nobody," she whispered. "A merchant's daughter with no dowry, no connections, no—" "You're mine," Kieran said simply, "if you'll have me." And Elena realized that for the first time in her life, someone was asking what she wanted instead of telling her what she owed. "Yes," she breathed, and when Kieran's smile broke across his face like sunrise, Elena thought she might finally understand what home was supposed to feel like. 2 weeks later, Elena stood in the grandest ballroom in the kingdom and wondered if she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. The Royal Assembly met only twice a year, bringing together every noble house in the realm. Tonight, the palace blazed with 1,000 candles, their light reflecting off gilt mirrors and marble columns that soared toward painted ceilings. Lords and ladies moved through the vast space like chess pieces, their conversations a web of politics and power that Elena was only beginning to understand. She wore midnight blue silk tonight, a gown that Kieran had commissioned for her that made her feel like a different person entirely. The fabric whispered against her skin as she moved, and sapphires glittered at her throat, a gift that had made her mother weep with joy. But it was the absence of jewellery that mattered most. Her left hand was still bare, though not empty. Kieran's fingers were laced through hers, warm and steady as they moved through the crowd together. "Breathe," he murmured in her ear, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Elena tried, but the weight of hundreds of stares made it difficult. Everyone wanted to see the merchant's daughter who had captured their king's attention. Some faces showed curiosity, others displayed barely concealed disdain. "They're all watching," she whispered back. "Let them." Kieran's thumb traced across her knuckles in a gesture that was both comforting and possessive. "You belong here, Eleanor, with me." Before Elena could respond, a commotion near the ballroom's entrance caught her attention. The crowd was parting, whispers rising like wind through wheat, and Eleanor felt her blood turn to ice. Marcus Blackwood strode into the ballroom, flanked by 3 other lords, his face set in grim determination. He'd cleaned up well since their confrontation, his fair hair perfectly styled, his formal attire impeccable. But Eleanor could see the cold fury in his pale eyes, the set of his jaw that promised trouble. "Kieran," she started, but he was already moving. "Stay close to me," he said quietly, his body shifting into a protective stance that made several nearby nobles step back. Marcus cut through the crowd with purpose, his allies trailing behind like hunting hounds. When he reached the centre of the ballroom, he stopped and raised his voice to carry across the vast space. "Your Majesty," Marcus called out, his tone dripping with false respect, "I come before this assembly to address a grave injustice." The ballroom fell silent. Hundreds of faces turned toward the drama unfolding in their midst, eager for the spectacle. Elena felt Kieran's hand tighten on hers, his body radiating controlled tension. "Lord Blackwood," Kieran replied, his voice carrying the authority of absolute power. "You have something to say to this assembly?" "I do." Marcus stepped forward, his pale eyes finding Elena in the crowd. 3 weeks ago, a sacred contract was broken. A betrothal agreement witnessed and sealed was cast aside as if it meant nothing. His voice rose, playing to the crowd. "Lady Eleanor Whitmore was bound to me by law and tradition, yet she now stands at your side as if she has the right to choose her own fate." Murmurs rippled through the assembled nobles. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her chin high. Kieran's thumb continued its steady movement across her knuckles, an anchor in the storm. "Contracts can be dissolved," Kieran said calmly, "when the terms are fulfilled or the agreement is voided by mutual consent." "But this was not mutual consent," Marcus's voice cracked like a whip. "This was coercion, bribery. A simple merchant's daughter does not have the means to buy her way out of a binding agreement." His eyes blazed with righteous anger. "Unless, of course, someone with greater resources intervened for personal gain." The implications hung in the air like poison. Elena heard the whispers starting, saw the calculating looks on noble faces. Marcus was painting her as a fortune hunter, Kieran as a king who abused his power for lust. "Be very careful, Blackwood," Kieran said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the ballroom. "You're accusing your king of corruption." Marcus lifted his chin defiantly. "I'm asking for justice, Your Majesty. Lady Elena was promised to me. Her family's debts were collateral on that promise. If those debts were paid by royal treasury to benefit the crown's interests, then perhaps this assembly should know." Elena felt the golden thread in her chest pull tight with fury. She started to step forward, to defend herself and Kieran, but found her way blocked by Lord Garrett Thornfield, one of Marcus's allies. "Perhaps," Thornfield said silkily, "Lady Eleanor should answer for herself. Tell us, my dear, did you enter into a binding betrothal contract with Lord Blackwood?" Every eye in the ballroom turned to Eleanor. She felt exposed, pinned like a butterfly under glass, but she kept her voice steady. "I did." "And did your family benefit financially from the dissolution of that contract?" "They did." "Then surely," Marcus said, triumph creeping into his voice, "you understand that your association with His Majesty calls into question the integrity of royal decisions." The silence that followed was deafening. Elena could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her, could see the doubt creeping into noble faces. She was about to become the scandal that brought down a king. That's when Kieran stepped forward. Power radiated from him like heat from a forge, and Eleanor felt the very air in the ballroom shift. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of mountains, the authority of storms. "You want to question my integrity?" Kieran asked, his amber eyes sweeping across the assembly. You want to know why I paid the debts of a merchant family? Why I intervened in a betrothal contract?" He moved to stand directly beside Elena, his presence both shield and sword. "Because she is everything," he said simply, and the words hit the ballroom like thunder. "Because the moment I saw her, I knew I would move heaven and earth to protect her. Because she is my chosen mate, my queen, and anyone who questions her worth questions me." Elena's breath caught in her throat. Around them, the assembly erupted in whispers and gasps. "You speak of law and tradition," Kieran continued, his voice rising. "Then know this. By the ancient laws of our kind, a true mate bond supersedes all other contracts. Lady Elena Whitmore is mine by right of blood, by right of bond, by right of choice." His eyes found Marcus in the crowd, and his smile was sharp as winter. "Your contract was void the moment our souls recognized each other." "You can't prove—" Marcus started, but Kieran cut him off. "Can't I?" Before Elena could process what was happening, Kieran's hand cupped her face with infinite gentleness. His amber eyes met hers, and she saw love and promise and forever reflected in their depths. "Trust me," he whispered, and then his lips touched hers. The kiss was everything Eleanor had dreamed, and nothing she had expected. Fire raced through her veins, the golden thread in her chest blazing so bright she thought it might burn her alive. Around them, gasps echoed through the ballroom as light began to emanate from where their bodies touched. Pure, golden light that spoke of ancient magic and eternal bonds. When they broke apart, Elena was gasping for breath. But the light remained, wrapping around them like a second skin, visible proof of the mate bond that tied their souls together. "By the ancient laws," Kieran announced to the stunned assembly, "I claim Elena Whitmore as my queen, my mate, my equal in all things. Let any who would challenge this union step forward now." The silence was absolute. Marcus stood frozen, his face white as parchment. His allies had melted away, leaving him alone in the centre of the ballroom. "Well?" Kieran asked, his arms sliding around Elena's waist. "Do you still question the validity of our bond, Lord Blackwood?" Marcus's mouth worked soundlessly. Then, without another word, he turned and fled from the ballroom, his footsteps echoing off marble floors. The moment he was gone, the assembly erupted into cheers. Elena found herself swept up in a whirlwind of congratulations and blessings, noble after noble approaching to offer their respect to their future queen. But all Elena could focus on was Kieran's hand in hers, the golden light that still danced around them, and the way he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his kingdom. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, leaning down so only she could hear. Elena smiled, feeling lighter than she had in her entire life. "Perfect," she whispered back, "absolutely perfect." And as the celebration swirled around them, Elena realized that sometimes the greatest courage was simply choosing to be chosen. The weeks that followed were a strange rhythm of learning to breathe in a world too big and beautiful to be real. Elena woke each morning in the royal palace, in chambers that could have housed her entire family's estate twice over. Silk curtains filtered golden sunlight across marble floors, and servants appeared as if by magic to tend fires she hadn't known she needed. But it was the man beside her, reading reports by the window with his dark hair catching the light, who made it all feel like home. "Good morning, my queen," Kieran would say each day, and the title that should have terrified her somehow felt like coming home to herself. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Those first days in the palace, Elena had wandered the corridors like a ghost, afraid to touch anything, afraid to speak too loudly, afraid to take up space she didn't deserve. The servants called her Your Majesty, and Elena flinched every time, certain they would realise their mistake and send her back to the merchant district where she belonged. Kieran had been infinitely patient. When Eleanor was too intimidated to speak during council meetings, he simply took her hand and let his touch anchor her. When she panicked about the formal dinners with foreign dignitaries, he taught her which fork to use and whispered jokes in her ear until she forgot to be afraid. When she woke gasping from nightmares about being dragged away from him, he held her until the golden thread in her chest settled into peace. "You're not an imposter," he would remind her during those dark moments. "You're exactly where you belong." It took Elena 3 weeks to believe him. The change came during a council meeting about grain distribution in the outer provinces. Elena had been listening, as she always did, taking mental notes about the kingdom she would someday help rule. But when Lord Chancellor Aldrich suggested cutting rations to fund road improvements, something inside her rebelled. "Respectfully," Elena found herself saying, her voice cutting through the discussion. "Those roads won't matter if people starve before winter." The council chamber fell silent. 12 of the most powerful men in the kingdom turned to stare at the merchant's daughter who had dared to speak. Elena felt her heart hammer against her ribs, but Kieran's hand found hers beneath the table. "Continue," he said simply, and Eleanor heard the pride in his voice. So she did. She spoke about the families she'd known growing up, about lean winters and the choice between heating homes and feeding children. She talked about distribution networks and storage methods and the difference between surviving and thriving. When she finished, the silence that followed was thoughtful instead of shocked. "An excellent point, Your Majesty," Lord Aldrich said finally. "Perhaps we should reconsider the timeline." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "Your Majesty." "You are the king's chosen mate," another councillor said gently. "Queen in all but ceremony. Your voice carries the same weight as his." That night, as Elena and Kieran walked through the palace gardens, she finally asked the question that had been burning in her chest for weeks. "Does it ever feel strange, knowing you could have had anyone, and you chose me?" Kieran stopped walking, turning to face her in the moonlight. "Elena, do you know what my life was like before I found you?" She shook her head, and Kieran's expression grew distant. "Empty," he said simply. "I ruled well enough, I suppose, made the decisions that needed making, attended the ceremonies that required my presence, but it was all duty, no joy. I went to bed alone and woke alone and told myself it was enough." His amber eyes found hers, and Elena felt her breath catch. "And then I saw you in that ballroom, looking like you were drowning in silk and suffocating on obligation, and I realised I'd been drowning too." Elena reached up to touch his face, marvelling that she had the right to do so. "Kieran." "You saved me," he said quietly. "Not the other way around. You gave me a reason to be more than just a king. You made me remember what it felt like to want something for myself instead of just for the kingdom." The golden thread in Elena's chest blazed with warmth, and before she could think twice, she rose on her toes and kissed him. Not the careful, hesitant kisses they'd shared before, but something deeper, hungrier, full of promise and forever. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Kieran rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," Elena whispered, the words spilling out like water from a broken dam. "I love you so much, it terrifies me." "Eleanor," Kieran's voice was rough with emotion. "I have loved you since the moment you showed me that ring and told me you were off limits. I loved your courage even when you were afraid. I loved your loyalty even when it meant losing you. I loved your strength even when you couldn't see it yourself." Elena felt tears slip down her cheeks, but for the first time in her life they were tears of joy. "I want to marry you," she said suddenly, the words surprising them both. "Not because you're a king, or because you solve my family's problems, or because of some supernatural bond. I want to marry you because you make me feel brave enough to be myself." Kieran's smile was devastating. "Is that a proposal, Lady Whitmore?" "It is," Elena said, laughing through her tears. "I'm proposing to the Alpha King in his own garden, and I don't care if that's backwards or improper, or—" "Yes," Kieran interrupted, sweeping her into his arms and spinning her around until she was dizzy with laughter. "Yes, Elena Whitmore, I will marry you." He set her down gently, his hands framing her face like she was made of spun glass. "But I have one condition." Elena's heart skipped. "What?" "Let me do this properly." Kieran dropped to one knee right there in the moonlit garden, producing a ring from his jacket that made Eleanor's breath catch. It wasn't the cold, ostentatious diamond Marcus had given her. This was warm gold set with amber stones that seemed to glow with their own light, delicate and fierce and perfect. "Elena Whitmore," Kieran said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his amber eyes. "Will you marry me, not because you have to, but because you want to? Will you be my queen, my partner, my equal in all things? Will you help me rule with wisdom and compassion and love?" Elena looked down at this impossible man who had turned her world upside down in the best possible way, and felt her heart expand until she thought it might burst. "Yes," she said, and when he slipped the ring onto her finger, it fit perfectly. "Yes to all of it, forever yes." As Kieran rose and kissed her again, Eleanor felt the last of her fears melt away. She wasn't a merchant's daughter playing at being queen anymore. She wasn't an impostor or a fortune hunter or a political liability. She was Eleanor Whitmore, chosen and beloved, and she was exactly where she belonged. 2 months later, as autumn painted the palace gardens in shades of gold and amber, Elena stood in her chambers preparing for her wedding. Her family bustled around her, her mother weeping happy tears as she arranged Elena's train, her father beaming with pride as he polished the family's ancient ceremonial dagger that would symbolize the binding of their houses. But it was her younger sister Mara who asked the question that made Elena pause. "Are you nervous?" Mara asked, helping to secure the delicate crown that would mark Elena as queen. Elena looked at herself in the mirror, taking in the woman she had become. Confident posture, steady hands, eyes that sparkled with joy instead of resignation. "No," she said, surprising herself with the truth of it, "I'm not nervous at all." Because somewhere in the palace, Kieran was getting ready for the same ceremony, probably enduring the same well-meaning fussing from his own attendants, and in a few hours they would stand before the assembled kingdom and choose each other again, this time with the whole world watching. Elena touched the amber ring on her finger, feeling the warmth that always answered her touch. Through the palace walls and garden paths, across courtyards and corridors, she felt the golden thread that connected her heart to his. She was ready to be a queen. But more than that, she was ready to be his queen, his partner, his equal in all the adventures yet to come. And as she heard the trumpets announcing the start of the ceremony, Elena smiled and walked toward her future with her head held high. The coronation took place at sunset, when the great cathedral blazed with golden light and the entire kingdom held its breath. Elena stood before the altar in a gown of ivory silk and gold thread, her amber crown catching the light from 1,000 candles. The cathedral was packed from floor to soaring ceiling. Every noble house in the realm gathered to witness the merchant's daughter become their queen. But Elena's eyes were only for the man standing beside her, resplendent in midnight blue and silver, his amber eyes warm with love and pride. "Do you, Elena Whitmore?" the Archbishop intoned, his voice echoing through the vast space. "Take Kieran Aldridge, Alpha King of this realm, as your husband, your mate, your equal partner in all things?" Elena looked into Kieran's eyes and felt the golden thread in her chest sing with certainty. "I do," she said, her voice carrying clear and strong. "Not because fate demands it, but because I choose it. Not because duty requires it, but because love makes it inevitable." The words weren't traditional, but they were true. Murmurs of approval rippled through the assembled crowd. "And do you, Kieran Aldridge," the Archbishop continued, "take Eleanor Whitmore as your wife, your mate, your equal partner in all things?" "I do," Kieran replied, his voice rough with emotion. I choose her as she has chosen me. I crown her not just as my queen, but as the other half of my soul." The ceremonial words that followed blurred together in Elena's mind. Ancient vows and binding promises, the weight of crowns and kingdoms settling on their joined hands. But what she would remember forever was the moment Kieran slipped the wedding band onto her finger, next to the amber engagement ring that had replaced Marcus's cold diamond. "With this ring," Kieran said softly, "I give you my heart, my kingdom, and my forever." Elena's response caught in her throat, tears blurring her vision. "With this ring," she managed, placing a matching band on his finger. "I give you my trust, my love, and my choice to stay." When the Archbishop pronounced them husband and wife, king and queen, the cathedral erupted in cheers that seemed to shake the very stones. But Eleanor barely heard them. All her attention was focused on Kieran's hands as they framed her face, on the amber eyes that looked at her like she was the answer to every prayer he'd never dared speak. "My queen," he whispered against her lips. "My king," she whispered back. Their kiss was soft and sweet and full of promise, witnessed by a kingdom that had learned to believe in fairy tales made real. The celebration afterward was a whirlwind of music and dancing, toasts and congratulations. Elena moved through it in a daze of joy, accepting the fealty of lords who had once looked down on her, dancing with foreign dignitaries who sought alliances, laughing at her sister's whispered jokes about the absurdity of it all. But the moment she treasured most came near midnight, when she and Kieran finally escaped to the palace balcony overlooking the gardens where they'd first confessed their love. "Do you remember?" Elena said, leaning against the stone railing with her crown finally removed and her hair loose around her shoulders. "When you told me that my engagement ring meant nothing?" Kieran moved to stand behind her, his arms circling her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "I remember." "You were right." Elena lifted her left hand, studying the amber stones that glowed like captured sunlight even in the moonlight. "This ring means everything, not because it's expensive or because it marks me as royal, but because it's a choice I made freely." "Eleanor." Kieran's voice was soft against her ear. "Do you have any regrets about leaving your old life behind?" Eleanor turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had become her anchor, her adventure, her home. "How could I regret finding myself?" As if summoned by her words, a figure appeared in the garden below. Marcus Blackwood moved like a shadow between the rose bushes, his face pale in the moonlight. He looked up at the balcony, and for a moment his eyes met Elena's. She felt no fear, no guilt, no second thoughts. Only a distant sort of pity for the man who had tried to cage something that was always meant to fly. Marcus nodded once, a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or farewell, and then melted back into the shadows. Elena doubted she would see him again. "And that," she said quietly, "is the last chapter of my old story." Kieran's arms tightened around her. "Ready to write a new one?" Elena smiled, thinking of all the adventures that awaited them, the kingdom to rule together, the changes they would make, the children who might someday play in these very gardens, the quiet mornings and passionate nights, the arguments they would weather, and the love that would see them through everything. "More than ready," she said, and rose on her toes to kiss her king. 3 years later, Eleanor stood in the same cathedral, but this time she held a small bundle in her arms. Prince Alexander had his father's amber eyes and his mother's stubborn chin, and he was sleeping peacefully through his own christening ceremony. "He's perfect," Elena's mother whispered from the front pew, tears streaming down her cheeks. The Whitmore family had thrived in their new role as extended royal family, her father now serving as advisor on trade policies, her sister married to a kind duke who made her laugh every day. "He is," Elena agreed, looking down at her son's tiny face. In 3 years of marriage, she and Kieran had weathered droughts and diplomatic crises, celebrated victories and mourned losses, grown into the kind of partnership she had never dared dream possible. The merchant's daughter, who had once believed she was worth nothing, now ruled a kingdom with wisdom and compassion. The man who had thought himself destined to rule alone had found his perfect match in a woman who challenged him to be better every day. And if sometimes, in quiet moments, Eleanor looked down at her wedding ring and marvelled at how a single choice could change everything, well, she had learned to believe in the power of choosing love over obligation, hope over fear, forever over safety. "Your Majesty!" Kieran appeared at her elbow, his own crown slightly askew and his formal robes wrinkled from chasing their energetic toddler daughter through the palace corridors. Princess Isabella had inherited her parents' sense of adventure and had decided the christening robes were much more interesting when used as a cape. "Crisis?" Eleanor asked, amused. "Princess Isabella has declared herself queen of the laundry room and is holding the head chambermaid hostage with demands for more cake." Elena laughed, the sound echoing through the cathedral and making baby Alexander stir in her arms. "I'll handle the negotiations. You take Alexander to the nursery." "Deal," Kieran said, accepting their son with practised ease. He leaned over to brush a soft kiss against Elena's lips. "I love you, my impossible queen." "I love you too, my patient king." As Elena hurried off to rescue the palace staff from their daughter's royal decree, she reflected on how perfect this imperfect life had become. Not because it was easy, ruling was never easy, but because every challenge was faced hand in hand with the person who understood her soul. She had traded a diamond ring that felt like a shackle for an amber band that felt like freedom. She had exchanged a life of obligation for one of choice, and every single day she woke up grateful for the courage to say yes to love, yes to herself, and yes to the impossible fairy tale that had somehow become beautifully, chaotically, perfectly real. Where are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments below. I love hearing your thoughts on Elena's journey from trapped to triumphant. If you'd like to support me, please subscribe. It's free and it helps more people hear these stories of love conquering all.